The night officer Brendan Cauley pulled Nessa Farrow over. She had been awake for 14 hours straight. She wasn't speeding, she wasn't weaving. She had both hands on the wheel of her 6-year-old Civic at exactly 31 miles per hour, heading north on Delmar Avenue toward the apartment she hadn't seen in 3 days because the ICU at St. Augustine Medical Center had needed her, and she had stayed. The lights came up behind her, somewhere between the 7-Eleven and the railroad crossing. Blue and red, strobing against the fog that settled low every night in this part of Millhaven, Ohio. Nessa checked her mirror, pulled to the curb, and cut the engine. She set her hands on the wheel at 10 and 2. She had learned a long time ago that the best thing a woman driving alone at 2 in the morning could do was make herself visible. She was still wearing her scrubs. Navy blue, with the St. Augustine logo embroidered over the left breast. Her hospital badge hung from the lanyard around her neck. Her disability placard, issued 3 months ago after the second surgery on her left knee, was hanging from the rearview mirror where it was supposed to be. The officer took a long time getting out of his car. When he finally reached her window, he stood slightly back from it, one hand on his belt, and said nothing for a moment. Just looked at her. Lice and registration, he said. Nessa already had them ready. She passed them through the window and waited. He looked at the license, looked at her, looked at the license again, the way people do when they're not actually reading it. "You know why I stopped you?" "No," she said. "I don't." "Tail light," he said. She didn't respond. Both tail lights had been working that morning. She had checked them in the hospital parking garage, the way she always did, because her mother had drilled that into her before Nessa ever got behind a wheel. "You check your lights. You check your tires. You give them nothing." "Step out of the vehicle," Cauley said. Nessa looked at him. "I'm sorry?" "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am. Officer." She glanced at his nameplate. "Officer Cauley, I just finished a 14-hour shift. I'm a nurse. I've got my badge right here. I'm not sure why. I'm not asking twice." She opened the door. The moment she put weight on her left leg, the pain shot up through her knee the way it always did after a long shift, sharp and bright, the kind that made her breath catch. She gripped the doorframe and stood, and she must have made some sound she wasn't aware of because Cauley said, "Problem? I had surgery," she said. "My knee. I have a disability placard. You can see it in the window." He didn't look at the window. What happened next took 45 minutes, and Nessa would replay it many times in the weeks that followed. Cauley told her he smelled alcohol. She told him she didn't drink. He told her to walk a straight line along the curb. She told him she couldn't, not without pain, not on this leg, not at 2 in the morning, after a shift like this one. He told her that wasn't his problem. He put her hands behind her back while she was still trying to explain, and the handcuffs clicked into place before she had finished the sentence. "I'm a nurse," she said again. Her voice didn't shake. She was proud of that later. "I work at St. Augustine. Call them. Call anyone." He put her in the back of the cruiser and went back to her car. She sat there in the dark, watching through the wire divider as he walked a slow circuit around her Civic, shining his flashlight into the windows. She thought about her patients. She thought about the woman in bed 7 who had finally turned a corner that afternoon, whose daughter had gripped Nessa's arm and said, "Thank you," the way people only say it when they really mean it. She thought about what her mother would say. She thought, he has no idea who he stopped. Nessa Theodora Farrow was 31 years old. She had grown up in Millhaven, the youngest of 3, in a house on Perkett Street where her grandmother had kept a garden that bloomed every May regardless of what the rest of the world was doing. She had left at 18 on a Navy scholarship, served 8 years as a hospital corpsman, 2 deployments, one to Bahrain and one to Okinawa, and 12 months embedded with a Marine unit in a place she still didn't talk about at dinner tables. She had come home to Ohio at 27 with a medical discharge, a rebuilt left knee, and a nursing degree that she'd finished online between surgeries. She had been at St. Augustine for 4 years. She ran the overnight ICU shift. Her patients' families called her by her first name. Her supervisor, a veteran charge nurse named Dolores Obi, had written in her last review, "Nessa Farrow is the kind of nurse we spend 20 years trying to train. She already is one." None of this was in the back of Officer Cauley's cruiser with her. What was in the back of the cruiser? Her hands cuffed behind her. Her hospital badge. Her phone, which was in the pocket of her scrub top, which Cauley did not know because he hadn't searched her. just cuffed her and put her in the car. She took the phone out slowly, carefully. She thought about who to call. She called Lieutenant Doris Mwangi. Doris had been her direct superior during her second deployment. She was now stationed at the Ohio Military Assistance Office, 40 minutes away. She picked up on the second ring. "Nessa, I need you to know where I am," Nessa said. She kept her voice quiet and even. "I'm in the back of a Millhaven police cruiser on Delmar Avenue. Officer Cauley, badge number." I didn't catch his badge number. "He stopped me after my shift and arrested me for DUI. I haven't had a drink. I want you to know where I am before anything else happens." There was a pause, short, professional. "I'm writing it down," Doris said. "Don't hang up unless you have to. I'm already moving." The station smelled like burned coffee and carpet cleaner. Nessa was processed by a desk officer who didn't make eye contact and put her in a holding room that had a metal bench along one wall and a camera mounted in the corner. She sat on the bench and waited. The field sobriety test at the curb had been inconclusive, which Cauley had written up as suspect uncooperative. He had not noted the disability placard. He had not noted the hospital badge. His incident report, which Nessa would not see for another 11 days, described her as agitated and noncompliant. She had been neither. She had been exhausted and frightened and very, very careful. Doris Mwangi arrived at the station at 3:47 in the morning. She did not come alone. She came with a man named Colonel Warren Hecht, retired, Nessa's former commanding officer from the Okinawa rotation, who had apparently been having dinner with Doris when Nessa called and had driven over in his own car. She also came with a woman named Petra, just Petra, no last name offered, who was apparently Doris's sister-in-law and apparently a civil rights attorney, though at that hour she was wearing a University of Michigan sweatshirt and carrying a gas station coffee. Nessa heard them before she saw them. She heard Doris's voice in the corridor, very calm and very precise, saying, "I want to see her. I want to see the arrest report. And I want the name of whoever authorized the DUI hold, because that woman has an active disability placard and a valid hospital ID and no prior record. And I want to understand what exactly Officer Cauley thought he was looking at." The door opened 20 minutes later. Doris stood there. Behind her, the desk officer looked like he wished he were somewhere else. "Let's go," Doris said. Nessa stood up. Her knee had stiffened in the cold of the holding room, and she had to take a moment before she could walk properly. Doris watched her do it, jaw set, and said nothing until they were in the corridor. "Are you hurt?" "The knee?" Nessa said. "Nothing new." Doris put a hand on her arm just briefly. "Warren's outside. Petra's getting the paperwork. You don't have to talk to anyone tonight if you don't want to." "I want to talk to everyone," Nessa said. The next morning, Nessa sat at her kitchen table with a legal pad and wrote down everything she remembered. Timestamps, the mileage on her car when she'd left the hospital, the exact location where Cauley had pulled her over, which she'd noted by the railroad crossing sign. Every word she could recall from the exchange. The way he'd held her wrists when he cuffed her. Not rough, exactly, but not careful either. The way you're not careful when you don't think it matters. She wrote for 2 hours. Then she went to St. Augustine's Occupational Health Clinic and had her knee documented. The physician on duty, Dr. Renata Osei, and this would matter later, that it was Renata, who had treated Nessa before and knew the surgical history, noted fresh bruising at the joint consistent with prolonged weight-bearing after surgery. She noted Nessa's range of motion, which was limited. She noted that Nessa reported being required to stand unsupported on the affected leg by law enforcement and to perform a balance test she had told the officer she was medically unable to complete. Renata looked up from her notes. "I want to document this as an injury caused by the incident," she said. "Document everything," Nessa said. The hospital's administration found out by noon through Dolores Obi, who had come in for the day shift and asked where Nessa was and been told by a colleague, and then walked directly into the office of the chief nursing officer and closed the door. The CNO, a careful man named Director Sheldon Vane, called the hospital's legal department. The legal department called Petra. By 2 that afternoon, Nessa had a team. She hadn't asked for one. She'd made one call to Doris at 3 in the morning, told her where she was, and then sat on a metal bench and waited. The rest had assembled itself, the way things assemble when you've spent 8 years in the Navy learning that the person next to you is the only thing standing between you and a very bad outcome, and you treat that person accordingly. and they remember. The dashcam footage came out of Officer Cauley's cruiser 11 days later, as part of the discovery process that Petra initiated with what Nessa privately thought was beautiful efficiency. The footage was time-stamped, clear, and not what Cauley's report described. It showed Nessa's hands at 10 and 2 when he approached. It showed her passing her license and registration through the window without being asked twice. It showed the disability placard clearly visible, hanging from her rearview mirror. Center frame, not ambiguous. It showed Nessa saying the words, "I had surgery on my knee," before being asked to exit the vehicle. It showed her exit from the car, the visible catch in her movement, the moment she gripped the door frame. It did not show her being aggressive. It did not show her being uncooperative. It showed a woman in scrubs at 2 in the morning doing everything right. There was also a body cam. The footage from that was shorter because Cauley had pressed the pause function twice, a technical action that Petra explained to Nessa over coffee in her actual office, which had a window and real furniture, was itself a protocol violation under department policy. "He paused it," Nessa said. "Twice," Petra said. "Once when you were getting out of the car, once when he was at your window for the second time." Nessa looked at her coffee cup. "What does that tell you?" "It tells me he knew what he was doing and didn't want it recorded." Petra set down her pen, which is actually very helpful to us. What Nessa hadn't known when she was sitting in that holding room at 3 in the morning was that she wasn't the first. Petra found it during the process of pulling Cauley's personnel file, which had been reviewed, technically flagged, and then quietly reintegrated into the system with no action taken. There had been 2 prior complaints in 3 years. One from a woman named Andy Hollins, a physical therapist at a clinic on the east side of Millhaven, who had been stopped at a similar hour and similarly detained on grounds that did not survive review. One from a man named George Tatum, not the same Tatum in the file Nessa had been given, a completely different person, who had a parking permit placard and a prosthetic leg and had been required to stand on it in the rain. Both complaints had been reviewed by the same supervisor. Both had been closed with no action taken. The supervisor's name was Captain Eldon Rue. Nessa read the file in Petra's office. When she was done, she put it down on the desk, very flat and precise, and said, "How many people do you think he's stopped?" It wasn't a question. "We're working on that," Petra said. The internal affairs process took 9 weeks. Nessa went back to work at the end of week 1 because her patients needed her and because she was not going to let the holding room define the calendar of her life. She worked her shifts. She checked in with Petra on her days off. She slept when she could, which was not as often as she needed, because she would wake at 2 or 3 in the morning and lie in the dark, listening to the sounds of her apartment building settling, and think about Andy Hollins standing on the side of the road and George Tatum standing in the rain. She thought about all the people who hadn't had a Doris to call. She thought about that a lot. Dolores Obi stopped by her station one night, midway through a shift, and stood for a moment watching Nessa chart. "How are you doing?" she said. Not a question, exactly. "I'm fine," Nessa said. "Then, no, I'm not. But I'm working on it." Dolores nodded. "The hospital is filing a formal statement with the department," she said. "Director Vane approved it this morning. It'll go into the record." Nessa looked up from the chart. "He didn't do it because Petra asked," Dolores said. "He did it because you've been here 4 years and you've never left a shift without making sure everyone in your unit was covered, and he knows that." She paused. "And because Petra asked." Nessa almost smiled. "Tell him thank you. Tell him yourself. He's coming to the hearing." The hearing was held on a Thursday morning in a conference room at the Millhaven Municipal Building. It was formal, recorded, and attended by more people than Nessa had expected. Doris Mwangi was there in dress uniform. Warren Hecht was there in a suit. Director Vane was there with 2 people from the hospital's legal department. Andy Hollins was there, which Nessa had not known would happen until she walked in and saw her sitting 2 rows back, and they looked at each other across a room full of people, and Andy nodded once, the way you nod to someone who knows the same thing you know. Cauley sat with his union representative. Captain Rue sat in the back. Petra presented the dashcam footage first. She did not narrate it. She let it run, beginning to end, and the room watched in silence. When it ended, she presented the body cam footage, both sections, including the 2 pauses, which she had a technical expert explain on the record. She presented Dr. Osie's documentation of Nessa's knee. She presented the disability placard registration. She presented Cauley's incident report alongside a line-by-line comparison to the footage. She presented the prior complaints. She presented the reviews that had found no action warranted. She presented documentation showing that both reviews had been conducted by Captain Rue. Captain Rue, in the back of the room, stopped looking at anyone. When Petra finished, Nessa was asked if she wanted to make a statement. She had written it out at her kitchen table, the same table where she'd written down the timestamps the morning after the arrest. She had revised it twice. She had read it to Doris, who had said very little. Just, it's true, and it's clear, and it's enough. She stood up. I want to talk about something specific, she said. Not about what I lost that night, because I didn't lose much. I was released. I went home. I went back to work. I want to talk about what it costs when a system teaches people that their complaints don't matter. Officer Cauley stopped me because he thought he could. He thought that because 3 years of history told him there were no consequences. That history didn't come from nowhere. It was built by processes that existed to protect the department rather than the people the department exists to serve. I'm not asking you to punish one officer. I'm asking you to look at how you built the system that told him it was safe to act the way he did. Because there are people I know about now, Andy Hollins, who is in this room, and George Tatum, who isn't, who tried to tell you 3 years ago. And nobody listened. She sat down. The room was quiet for a moment. Doris, 2 seats to her left, did not look at her. She was looking straight ahead. But under the table, her hand found Nessa's arm and held it for exactly 3 seconds, which is not something Doris Mwangi did often, and Nessa understood exactly what it meant. The findings came out 4 weeks later. Officer Brendan Cauley was suspended without pay, pending termination proceedings. Captain Eldon Rue was placed on administrative leave, while a secondary review examined the handling of both prior complaints. The department issued a formal statement. Language negotiated over 2 days between Petra and the city attorney, acknowledging a failure of internal oversight and committing to independent review of complaint handling procedures. Nessa read the statement on her phone in the break room between patients. She read it twice. Then she put her phone in her pocket and went back to her unit. The woman in bed 7, not the same woman as before, a new patient, someone's grandmother who had come in 3 days ago with respiratory failure and was now, today, sitting up and asking for the remote control, raised her hand when Nessa came in. There she is, the woman said. Here I am, Nessa said. She checked the chart. She checked the monitors. She adjusted the angle of the bed. She did all the things she had done on every shift for 4 years. And she did them with the same attention she always brought to them, because the attention was the point. Because this woman's granddaughter would come in at 4 o'clock, and she would look at the monitors and the chart, and she would look at whoever had been caring for her grandmother, and she would ask a question or not ask it out loud, but it would be there in her face. Is she safe here? Is someone actually watching? And Nessa would be there to say, without words, the things she had always been there to say, yes. I'm watching. I'm not going anywhere. Outside the window, Millhaven was going about its morning. The fog from the night before had burned off by 9, the way it always did, and the sun was coming through at a low angle the way it did in November, and the city looked exactly like what it was, ordinary, a little tired, full of people trying to get through the day. Nessa finished her charting. She refilled the woman's water. She walked out of the room and down the corridor toward the nurses' station, and the linoleum floor was the same linoleum it had always been, and the overhead lights were the same buzzing fluorescent they had always been, and the smell was antiseptic and coffee and something floral from someone's lotion, and it was all of it exactly where she had chosen to be. She had made one phone call at 3 in the morning from the back of a cruiser. She had written things down. She had gone back to work. She had stood up in a conference room and said, "Look at the system, not just the man." She had not won everything. She knew that. Cauley would contest the termination. The department's review would take months. George Tatum had moved out of Millhaven the previous year and declined to participate in the proceedings, and she understood that too. Understood it in a way she hadn't before the holding room, hadn't understood what it costs to keep being the person who raises their hand when the system has already told you, twice, that raising your hand doesn't work. But the finding was on record. The 2 pauses in the body cam footage were on record. Petra had filed the documentation with the State Oversight Board and with the Ohio ACLU and with 2 journalists who had been covering police accountability in Millhaven for 4 years and had been looking for exactly this kind of paper trail. Andy Hollins had emailed her that morning. 6 words, "Thank you for not letting it go." Nessa had written back, "Thank you for staying." She reached the nurse's station and sat down and pulled up the next chart, and the shift continued, and the hospital breathed around her the way hospitals do. Steady, necessary, full of people doing the hard and invisible work of keeping other people alive. And Nessa Farrow, 31 years old, Navy veteran, ICU nurse, daughter of Millhaven, pulled the chart toward her and read the first line and began.